We look at the map of the world and we see the 7 continents, bordered by familiar oceans and defined by centuries of exploration. But there is one landmass that remains a stubborn blank space in our collective consciousness, a massive white void at the bottom of the planet that we are told is nothing more than a sterile sanctuary for penguins and ice. We are conditioned to ignore it, to treat it as the irrelevant frozen basement of the world. But this is the single greatest lie in modern geography. Antarctica is not a nature reserve. It is a crime scene that has been frozen in time. It is the only place on Earth where the sworn enemies of the Cold War put down their guns and agreed to share the land, not out of peace, but out of fear of what they found there. From the mysterious military fleets that limped home broken in 1947 to the thermal anomalies detected by satellites deep beneath the ice today, every piece of evidence points to the terrifying reality that we are not alone on this planet. We are sharing it with something that is sleeping in the cold, something that has been waiting for the ice to melt. This is not a story about climate change. This is a story about a quarantined zone, a technological cover-up, and the ruins of a civilization that might redefine what it means to be human. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. To understand the magnitude of the secret hidden at the South Pole, we must first examine the silence that surrounds it. This silence was not an accident. It was a carefully constructed legal and military cage built in 1959, a year when the world was balancing precariously on the razor's edge of nuclear annihilation. To fully grasp the absurdity of the situation, you have to transport yourself back to the geopolitical atmosphere of the late 1950s. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a death grip, engaging in proxy wars across the globe, pointing thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other's cities and competing violently for every inch of strategic territory. Trust was non-existent. Paranoia was the currency of the day. Spies were everywhere, and the mere suggestion of cooperation was seen as treason. Yet, amidst this atmosphere of total global hostility, something inexplicable happened. 12 nations, including these 2 mortal enemies who were ready to incinerate the planet to defeat one another, quietly came together in a smoke-filled room in Washington, D.C. to sign the Antarctic Treaty. On paper and in the history books taught to children, this is presented as a triumph of diplomacy, a noble humanitarian effort where humanity decided to set aside its differences to protect a pristine environment for peace and science. They banned all military fortifications, all weapons testing, and all resource extraction. But if you look at history with a cynical, realistic eye, you realize that empires simply do not behave this way. They never have, and they never will. Consider the logic of conquest. Throughout human history, whenever a new landmass was discovered, the immediate instinct of any major power was to claim it, fortify it, and exploit it. If there was oil, they would drill it. If there was gold, they would mine it. If there was strategic ground, they would build a naval base on it to threaten their neighbors. Antarctica is not a small island. It is a continent larger than Europe and the United States combined. It is suspected to hold vast reserves of coal, oil, natural gas, and precious minerals beneath its ice shelf. In a world starved for resources, are we really expected to believe that the greediest, most aggressive industrial powers in history looked at a mountain of free resources and collectively said, "No thanks, let's save the penguins"? It defies all economic and military logic. The fact that the United States and the Soviet Union unanimously agreed to lock down the bottom of the world suggests that they were not protecting the continent from us. They were protecting us from the continent. Or, more sinisterly, they were protecting themselves from something they had found down there. The treaty effectively established a global cordon sanitaire, a quarantine zone along the 60th parallel south. It turned the entire continent into a massive Area 51, but instead of a fence in the Nevada desert, the barrier is an entire ocean and a wall of bureaucratic impossibility. Think about the restrictions that are still rigidly enforced today, over 60 years later. You cannot simply buy a plane ticket and fly to the South Pole to explore freely like you can in Europe or Asia. Independent travel is nearly impossible and legally hazardous. Every expedition, every ship, and every plane must be approved, monitored, and guided by authorized governmental bodies. You must submit detailed environmental impact statements, obtain permits that are rarely granted to civilians, and adhere to strict paths. If you attempt to sail your own boat into the restricted waters south of the 60th parallel without permission, you will be intercepted by military naval vessels, often described as fishery patrol or coast guard, and turned back or arrested. This is not how you treat a nature reserve. This is how you treat a prison or a military black site. The flight paths of commercial airliners are carefully routed to avoid flying directly over the central continent. The official explanation is always safety, the lack of emergency landing strips, the extreme weather, the magnetic interference that messes with navigation systems. But to the conspiratorial mind, this looks like a visual blockade. They do not want civilian eyes looking down at the interior. They do not want anyone seeing what is being built or dug up in the whiteout. When you read the fine print of the treaty, specifically Article 1, it prohibits any measures of a military nature, yet the logistics of the continent are almost entirely run by military personnel. The heavy-lift cargo planes that land at McMurdo Station are Air Force jets. The icebreakers that clear the path are Navy or Coast Guard vessels. The satellite surveillance that monitors the ice sheet is run by the National Reconnaissance Office. It is a military operation disguised as a scientific camping trip. The scientists who live there are subjected to psychological screening and non-disclosure agreements that rival those of top-secret weapons programs. What kind of geology requires a security clearance? The treaty also conveniently suspends all territorial claims. This means that while countries like Norway, Australia, and Chile have claims on the map, these claims are effectively frozen. No one owns it, but everyone guards it. This level of international cooperation is unprecedented in human history. It mirrors the behavior of a dysfunctional family that hates each other but agrees to keep the basement door locked because they all know there is a monster downstairs that threatens the entire house. The timing of the treaty is also deeply suspicious. The rush to ratify this document came immediately after the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. This was a massive global scientific project where nations mapped the interior of Antarctica for the first time with modern technology using ground-penetrating radar, seismic sounding, and extensive aerial photography. It was during this specific period of intense scrutiny that the mood changed. Before 1957, nations were planting flags and talking about colonization and mining. After 1958, they suddenly panicked and rushed to seal the continent off. It implies that during the International Geophysical Year, they found something. Was it a geological anomaly that defied standard physics, the ruins of a civilization that predates the last ice age, or perhaps a portal to a cavernous interior that shattered their understanding of the planet's structure? Whatever it was, the reaction was swift and absolute: containment. We have to consider the terrifying possibility that the Cold War geopolitical theater was, in part, a distraction. While the public was busy digging fallout shelters, watching the news about the Berlin Wall and worrying about the bomb, the true elites were quietly moving assets. and attention to the frozen wasteland. The Treaty of 1959 was the moment the Iron Curtain was drawn not across Europe, but around Antarctica. It created a separate world, a breakaway civilization where the rules of the rest of the planet do not apply. And this silence has been maintained for over 60 years, unbroken by war, economic crashes, or political shifts. Regimes have fallen, the Berlin Wall has crumbled, the Soviet Union has dissolved into Russia, yet the blockade of Antarctica remains absolute. This consistency proves that the secret held there is more important than any ideology, any religion, or any national interest. It is a secret that threatens the fundamental narrative of human history, and to keep it, they constructed a legal fortress that no citizen is allowed to breach. We are living on a planet where we are arrogantly told we have mapped every inch, yet an entire continent, the size of a massive empire, remains a blurred image, a forbidden zone where the only approved story is one of ice, wind, and emptiness. But the wind is blowing from the south, and it carries the whispers of a history that refuses to stay buried. If the Antarctic Treaty is the heavy padlock on the door of the southern continent, then Operation Highjump is the moment someone tried to kick that door down and got burned by what was waiting on the other side. To understand the fear that drove the global elite to quarantine Antarctica, we have to look at the events of 1946, a time when the ink on the surrender documents of World War II was barely dry. The world was exhausted. Europe was a smoking ruin, Japan was decimated by nuclear fire, and the soldiers of the United States were returning home, desperate for peace and normalcy. Yet in this moment of global demobilization, the United States Navy did something completely baffling. Instead of scaling down, they launched the largest naval expedition to the polar regions in human history. They didn't call it an invasion, of course. That would have raised too many questions. The official press releases described Operation Highjump as a benign scientific survey, a training mission designed to test military equipment in extreme cold weather conditions and to map the coastline for potential future bases. But you do not send a war fleet to take pictures of icebergs. You do not mobilize Task Force 68, a massive armada consisting of 13 heavy ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, the submarine USS Senet, 2 destroyers, tankers, icebreakers, and a staggering 4,700 combat-ready troops, just to count penguins. This was not a scientific team. This was an invasion force. It was a fleet built for war, armed for war, and commanded by the legendary Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a man who knew the poles better than anyone on Earth, and a national hero who would not be wasted on a frivolous camping trip. The timeline of the mission itself screams of a hidden agenda. The expedition was funded and outfitted for a duration of 6 to 8 months. They brought enough food, fuel, and munitions to sustain a siege on the ice. They planned to establish Little America 4, a massive fortress of a base that would serve as the U.S. foothold in the south. The fleet arrived in the Ross Sea in late 1946, carrying the arrogance of a military that had just defeated the Axis powers and possessed the atomic bomb. They believed they were the masters of the planet. But the reality of what happened on the ice tells a completely different story, one of confusion, panic, and a humiliating retreat. The mission that was supposed to last half a year was abruptly and inexplicably cancelled after just 8 weeks. The fleet limped back to the United States with missing aircraft, damaged ships, and casualties that have never been fully explained to the public. The official Navy reports blamed bad weather and severe conditions, claiming that the early onset of winter made operations impossible. But since when does the U.S. Navy, the most powerful maritime force in history, run away from a storm? They had icebreakers, they had expert meteorologists. The weather excuse was a flimsy cover story that fooled no one who was paying attention. The rumors that swirled around the returning sailors, men who were threatened with court-martial if they spoke about what they saw, painted a picture of a nightmare. They didn't speak of blizzards or ice shelves, they spoke of a battle of Antarctica. According to leaked testimonies and the diaries of flight crews, the fleet did not encounter just the elements. They encountered an enemy. Reports describe flying discs, or saucers, that emerged from the freezing waters and flew at impossible speeds, harassing the fleet and weaving through the formations of American aircraft like they were standing still. These were the Foo fighters reported by pilots over Europe, but here they were aggressive. They were described as silent, glowing craft that possessed no visible wings or engines, yet could outmaneuver the Navy's best Corsair fighters and PBM Mariner flying boats. One chilling account describes a localized engagement where these disc-shaped craft used a type of beam weapon, or concentrated energy, to incinerate aircraft in mid-air, dismantling the primitive propeller-driven machines of the U.S. Navy with the ease of a child crushing a toy. It was a collision between two eras, the industrial might of the mid-20th century clashing with a technology that appeared to be hundreds, if not thousands, of years ahead of its time. The American forces, victorious in a global war just months prior, found themselves utterly defenseless against an adversary that defied the laws of physics. This wasn't just sailor talk or hallucination born of snowblindness. The most damning evidence comes from the commander himself. Upon his return, before the gag order was fully clamped down, Admiral Byrd gave a candid and terrifying interview to Lee Van Atta of the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, published on March 5, 1947. Byrd didn't mince words. He was shaken. He warned the world that the United States needed to prepare immediately for a new kind of war. He stated explicitly, it is necessary for the USA to take defensive actions against enemy air fighters which can come from the polar regions. He went on to say, in case of a new war, the United States would be attacked by fighter planes that can fly from pole to pole with incredible speed. Who was flying these planes? The Soviets didn't have that technology. They were still stealing blueprints for the atomic bomb. The Americans obviously didn't have it, or they wouldn't have been retreating. Byrd wasn't talking about a foreign nation. He was talking about a force that operated from Antarctica itself, a force that used the poles not as a wasteland, but as a highway. His warning was clear. The monopoly on air superiority that the US enjoyed was over. There was another player on the board, and they were dug in deep at the bottom of the world. The aftermath of Operation Highjump was a flurry of classification and tragedy. Admiral Byrd was hospitalized and interrogated by the U.S. Navy Security Services. His flight logs and personal diaries were seized and classified top secret. He was effectively silenced, a hero put out to pasture because his truth was too dangerous. But the cover-up claimed even higher victims. James Forrestal, the first U.S. Secretary of Defense and the man who oversaw Operation Highjump, began to unravel shortly after the operation's failure. He became obsessed with the idea of an invasion, ranting about them coming for us. In 1949, he was committed to Bethesda Naval Hospital for exhaustion. On May 22, 1949, his body was found on a third-floor roof, below his 16th-floor window. The official ruling was suicide, claiming he jumped. But the details were murky: scratch marks on the windowsill, a bathrobe sash tied tight around his neck. Conspiracy theorists have long argued that Forrestal was suicided because he was on the verge of revealing the truth about what the Navy had found in Antarctica. He was the highest-ranking civilian official in the military, and he knew too much about the enemy that Byrd had encountered. Operation Highjump remains the smoking gun of the Antarctic mystery. It was the turning point. Before Highjump, the U.S. attitude was arrogance and conquest. They went south to claim the land and kick out any squatters, likely hunting for the rumoured last battalion of the Nazis. But after Highjump, the strategy shifted instantly from conquest to containment. They never sent a massive war fleet again. Instead, they returned with diplomats, lawyers and scientists. They built the wall of the Antarctic Treaty. They chose to quarantine the monster rather than fight it, because they knew they couldn't win. The bad weather that forced Byrd to retreat was not wind and snow. It was a technological superiority that rendered the US military obsolete in a matter of minutes. The world moved on, distracted by the Cold War and the space race, but the scars of Highjump remained. Something is down there, guarding the ice, something that has the power to turn a fleet of warships around and send them running home. And ever since 1947, we have been respectfully staying on our side of the fence, terrified of provoking it again. To understand the face of the enemy that Admiral Byrd might have been chasing across the ice, we have to rewind the clock a full decade, back to a regime that was driven by a terrifying blend of industrial ruthlessness and esoteric mysticism. We tend to think of the Third Reich as a purely political and military machine, a monstrous engine of war built on tanks, rockets, and hate. But to view the Nazis solely through the lens of conventional history is to miss the dark heart of their ideology. The inner circle of the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, was not just interested in conquering Europe, they were obsessed with rewriting the metaphysical history of the world. They were deeply entrenched in the occult, members of secret orders like the Thule Society and the Vril Society, groups that operated in the shadows long before Hitler took power. These societies believed in a warped alternative history where the Germanic people were not just a nation, but the descendants of a godlike super race of Aryans who had once ruled the world from a lost continent in the far north called Thule, or Hyperborea. They believed that this civilization was destroyed by a cataclysm, a shifting of the poles that froze their paradise and scattered the survivors. For the Nazis, World War II was not just a battle for territory, it was a spiritual crusade to rediscover their lost heritage and reclaim the ancient technologies of their ancestors. When they couldn't find the ruins of Thule in the Arctic North, their gaze turned to the only other place on Earth that held the secrets of the deep freeze, Antarctica. In 1938, while the rest of the world was anxiously watching the political maneuvering in Europe and bracing for the inevitable outbreak of war, Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, sanctioned a massive and incredibly expensive expedition to the Antarctic. This was not a whim, it was a strategic priority that consumed resources the Reich desperately needed for the coming conflict. They outfitted a freighter, the Schwabenland, transforming it into a mobile aircraft carrier equipped with steam catapults and massive cranes capable of launching and retrieving two Dornier-Wal flying boats, the Passat and the Boreas. The mission was commanded by Captain Alfred Richer, and its target was not random. They headed specifically for Queen Maud Land, a vast, unexplored region of the continent claimed by Norway. Why there? Because ancient esoteric maps and perhaps intelligence gathered from their occult network suggested that this specific sector was different. It was the gateway. When the Schwabenland arrived off the coast of Antarctica in January 1939, the German pilots began a relentless aerial survey. They flew over vast swathes of the White Desert, photographing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that no human eye had ever seen. But they didn't just take pictures, they laid a claim. Every 25 kilometers, they dropped heavy aluminum poles stamped with the swastika, weighted arrows designed to pierce the ice and stand upright, literally planting the Nazi flag into the skin of the continent thousands of times. They renamed this massive territory Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, declaring it an eternal possession of the Third Reich. But the true discovery was not the ice, it was what broke through the ice. The pilots reported anomalous features that shouldn't have existed. They found the Shangri-La oasis, a freak of geology where geothermal vents heated the ground from below, creating ice-free lakes of fresh water and patches of vegetation in the middle of the frozen wasteland. They described massive thermal vents and tunnel entrances, vast, warm caverns hollowed out under the glaciers by volcanic heat, large enough to hide a city or a fleet. This was the Shangri-La they had been searching for. It confirmed their wildest esoteric theories, that the Earth was honeycombed with habitable pockets protected from the surface elements. This discovery changed everything. The Nazis realized that Antarctica was not just a block of ice, it was a fortress. It was a place where they could build a stronghold that was completely invulnerable to the bombers and armies of the Allies. It was a place where they could continue their research into advanced propulsion, rocketry, and the occult arts without fear of interruption. Throughout the war, while the Battle of the Atlantic raged, Allied naval intelligence noticed a peculiar pattern. German U-boats were constantly making trips to the South Atlantic, far away from the shipping lanes they were supposed to be hunting. These grey wolves were not looking for targets. They were functioning as a supply train. They were ferrying equipment, mining machinery, scientists and specialized personnel to the southern sanctuary. The sheer volume of material that vanished south suggests a massive construction project. We are not talking about a few tents in the snow. We are talking about the excavation of a subterranean complex, an industrial base powered by the geothermal energy of the Earth itself. The most chilling confirmation of this project came from the highest levels of the German Navy. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet and the man who would eventually succeed Hitler as the head of state, made a series of cryptic and boastful statements that have haunted historians for decades. In 1943, at the height of the war, he declared to a graduating class of naval cadets, "The German submarine fleet is proud of having built for the Führer, in another part of the world, a Shangri-La on land, an impregnable fortress." Where was this fortress? It wasn't in France, it wasn't in Norway, it was in another part of the world. Later, during the Nuremberg trials, he was quoted as saying that the Navy had found an earthly paradise, an invulnerable fortress for the Führer. These are not the words of a man speaking metaphorically. Dönitz was a pragmatist, a master strategist. If he said they built a fortress, they built a fortress. And considering the massive resources poured into the Neuschwabenland expedition and the unexplained U-boat traffic, the conclusion is terrifyingly logical. As the Third Reich began to crumble in 1945, the rat lines to South America helped high-ranking officials escape, but the true elite, the scientists, and the technology may have gone further south. The Allies were terrified of this possibility. The American intelligence agencies, the British MI6 and the Soviets, were all frantically hunting for the Nazi wonder weapons, the jet fighters, the V-2 rockets, and the rumored anti-gravity discs. They found the blueprints, they found the factories, but often the prototypes and the key scientists were gone. They had vanished into the ghost convoy. The fear that the Nazis hadn't just been defeated, but had relocated to a place where they couldn't be reached, was the driving force behind the paranoia of the post-war years. It explains why the US didn't demobilize its Antarctic fleet, but instead sent an armada down there just a year later. They weren't exploring, they were hunting a fugitive regime that had traded global conquest for a frozen citadel. The Nazi obsession with Antarctica wasn't a side project, it was the ultimate contingency plan. They believed that whoever controlled the poles controlled the world, or at least held the key to the inner world. And looking at the massive geothermal caverns of Neuschwabenland, they might have found exactly what they were looking for: a place to wait, to rebuild, and to prepare for the next phase of the war. A phase that would be fought not with tanks, but with technology that looked like magic to the uninitiated. The story of the Nazis in Antarctica does not end with the fall of Berlin. In fact, for many military historians and conspiracy researchers, the fall of Berlin was simply the distraction that allowed the real story to begin. As the Allied armies closed in on the German capital in the spring of 1945, squeezing the life out of the Third Reich, a strange and terrifying phenomenon was recorded by naval intelligence officers across the Atlantic. It was a massive, coordinated disappearance. While the bulk of the German army was surrendering or being captured, a specific segment of the Nazi war machine simply vanished into thin air. We are talking about the crème de la crème of the SS, the top scientists from the Wunderwaffe, Wonder Weapon programs, and most crucially, a massive fleet of the most advanced submarines ever built. According to official records, dozens of Type 21 U-boats, technological marvels that could stay submerged for days and travel silently at high speeds, were unaccounted for in the surrender logs. They didn't sink, they didn't surrender in European ports, they just left. For months, the Allies were baffled. Then, in the summer of 1945, long after the instruments of surrender had been signed, two of these ghost submarines, the U-530 and the U-977, suddenly surfaced in the harbor of Mar del Plata, Argentina. The arrival of these grey wolves sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. When the Argentine authorities boarded the vessels, they found crews that were exhausted, on the brink of starvation, and strangely tight-lipped. The commanders were interrogated relentlessly by US and British agents. Where had they been for nearly 3 months since the war ended? Why did they have enough fuel to travel halfway around the world, but no food? And most suspiciously, why were their cargo holds completely empty? A submarine on a combat patrol carries torpedoes. A submarine fleeing for survival carries supplies. These boats were stripped clean. The prevailing theory, supported by fragmented testimonies and tracked shipping routes, is that these U-boats were the tail end of a massive ghost convoy that had been ferrying high-value assets out of Europe for years. They hadn't just arrived in Argentina from Germany, they had likely just completed a drop-off run to the only place on Earth safe from Allied eyes, Base 211. Base 211, often referred to in whispers as New Berlin or New Berchtesgaden, is the alleged subterranean city constructed within the geothermal caverns of Neuschwabenland. Intelligence reports from the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and the British SIS contain scattered references to a massive construction project undertaken by the SS towards the end of the war. It is believed that thousands of concentration camp prisoners and specialized engineering battalions were transported to the ice to hollow out the volcanic tunnels, building a self-sustaining industrial complex fueled by the heat of the Earth. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a factory, and the product they were manufacturing was the future. This brings us to the darkest secret of the Nazi war effort. Die Glocke, or the bell. Overseen by the ruthless SS General Hans Kammler, a man who disappeared without a trace in 1945 and was never brought to justice, the bell was a device that defied the known laws of physics. Described by whistleblowers and recovered documents as a bell-shaped metallic object about 9 feet wide and 12 feet high, it contained 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a violet liquid metal substance codenamed Zerum-525, likely a radioactive isotope of mercury. When activated, the bell emitted a buzzing sound and a terrifying field of energy that disrupted gravity, time, and biological matter. Plants placed near it decayed into a black goo in minutes. crystals formed in the blood of exposed animals. This was not a weapon of war in the traditional sense. It was a propulsion drive. It was an engine designed to manipulate the fabric of space-time, creating an anti-gravity field that would allow a craft to lift off without wings, without rockets, and without noise. If the Nazis managed to transport General Kammler, his team of scientists, and the prototypes of the Bell to the impregnable fortress of Base 211, they would have had the perfect, undetectable laboratory to perfect the technology. This connects chillingly to the phenomenon of the Foo Fighters. Throughout the war, Allied bomber pilots over Germany and the Pacific reported being followed by glowing, saucer-shaped or spherical objects that danced around their formations. These objects moved with impossible agility, making right-angle turns at supersonic speeds that would liquefy a human pilot inside a conventional aircraft. They were immune to gunfire and seemed to be observing rather than attacking. At the time, the Allies thought they were German secret weapons, and the Germans thought they were Allied secret weapons. But in hindsight, they appear to be the test flights of this gravity-defying technology. By 1947, during Admiral Byrd's Operation Highjump, these prototypes had likely evolved into fully functional combat craft. The flying discs that Byrd reported were not extraterrestrial. They were the Haunebu and Vril craft, the final evolution of the Nazi saucer program. Imagine the shock of the US Navy. They went down to fight a remnant of a defeated army, expecting freezing soldiers with rifles, and instead they ran into a breakaway civilization that had leaped 100 years into the future. This suggests a terrifying alternative history where World War II didn't really end. One side just exited the game to build a new board. The technology that crashed in Roswell, New Mexico in July 1947, just months after Byrd returned from Antarctica, might not have been a visitor from another star system at all. It might have been a reconnaissance craft from the south, a drone, or a manned vessel from Base 211 that malfunctioned while surveilling the US nuclear capabilities in the desert. The implications are staggering. It means that for the last 70 years a shadow superpower has existed in parallel with our own, hidden beneath the ice, possessing technology that makes our fighter jets look like paper airplanes. It explains the secrecy. It explains why NASA was formed by former Nazi scientists like Werner von Braun, perhaps to compete with, or communicate with, their old comrades in the South. It explains why the Antarctic Treaty is so rigid. The global elite aren't just hiding a ruin, they are engaged in a decades-long standoff with a technologically superior faction that holds the high ground at the bottom of the world. Base 211 isn't a myth, it is the silent ticking heart of a Cold War that never actually ended. If the story of Nazi bases and flying saucers feels too much like science fiction, we must turn our attention to something far more tangible, something you can see with your own eyes in museums today, the ghost maps. These are charts and navigational documents that simply should not exist. They are historical anomalies that slap the face of mainstream geology and history. To understand why, we have to look at the official timeline. We are taught in every school and university that Antarctica was first discovered in 1820 by a Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev. Before that date, the southern continent was just a theoretical concept, a terra australis incognita that philosophers guessed might be there to balance the landmass of the north. But if Antarctica was unknown to human eyes until the 19th century, how do we explain the Piri Reis map? Drawn in 1513 by the famous Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, this map was discovered in the dusty archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in 1929. At first glance, it looks like a beautiful but standard portolan chart of the time drawn on gazelle skin. It depicts the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America with a precision that was remarkably advanced for the 16th century. But the real shock, the detail that has kept historians awake at night for nearly 100 years, lies at the bottom of the map. Extending from the tip of South America, curving eastward, is a coastline that matches the Queen Maud Land region of Antarctica. But there is a massive problem. Piri Reis didn't draw ice. He drew land. He depicted rivers, estuaries, mountain ranges, and bays in a region that is currently buried under a mile-thick sheet of solid, impenetrable ice. Skeptics and mainstream historians immediately tried to dismiss this. They claimed Piri Reis simply ran out of paper and bent the coast of South America, or that he was drawing a fictional land based on myth. But in 1949, a joint British-Swedish expedition conducted a comprehensive seismic survey of the Antarctic ice cap. They used sonar and explosive soundings to map the actual bedrock topography hidden deep beneath the glaciers. When the results came back, the geologists were stunned into silence. The subglacial coastline, the actual shape of the land under the ice, matched the Piri Reis map almost perfectly. Specifically, the map shows mountain ranges in the interior of Queen Maud Land that are currently completely submerged in ice, invisible to the naked eye, yet Piri Reis placed them exactly where the seismic data said they should be. How is this possible? How could a 16th century Turkish admiral know the topography of a continent that had supposedly been frozen for millions of years? Piri Reis himself gives us the answer in his marginal notes. He wrote that he did not survey the land himself. He admitted that he was merely a compiler, stitching together information from 20 older source maps. He claimed some of these source maps dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, and even further back, salvaged from the burning library of Alexandria. This implies something terrifyingly profound. Someone had mapped Antarctica before it froze. And Piri Reis is not a lone anomaly. He is part of a pattern. The Oronteus Phineus map, published in 1531, depicts the entire continent of Antarctica with shocking accuracy. It shows the continent with its correct shape and location, but again, completely ice-free. It details mountain ranges and rivers flowing into an open sea at the exact locations where massive glaciers like the Beardmore Glacier now sit. The Boache map of 1737 goes even further. It depicts Antarctica not as a single solid landmass, but as two large islands separated by a frozen waterway running through the middle. This is a geological fact that modern science only confirmed recently with satellite radar technology. We now know that if you melt the ice, Antarctica is indeed an archipelago of two major landmasses. Philippe Boache could not have known this in the 18th century unless he was copying from a source map that was thousands of years old, a map made by someone who sailed those waters when they were liquid. These ghost maps are the smoking gun of lost history. They prove that our timeline is fundamentally broken. They suggest that in the deep human past, perhaps around 12,000 years ago or more, Antarctica was not a frozen wasteland. It was a temperate, habitable land, likely home to a sophisticated maritime civilization that had the mathematical knowledge to calculate longitude and map the spherical Earth long before the Greeks or the Europeans. These were the sea kings of the ancient world, the people who built the megaliths, the people who sailed the global ocean. The ice sheet that covers Antarctica today is not a permanent feature of the planet. It is a recent tombstone. It is a blanket that fell suddenly, covering the cities, the ports, and the forests of a world that we have forgotten. The elites who study these maps know the truth. We are not discovering Antarctica, we are rediscovering it. The ice is just a temporary interruption in the history of that continent, and as it melts, the evidence of who lived there and who mapped it will be revealed for all to see. To reconcile the impossible existence of the Piri Reis map with the frozen reality of the modern South Pole, we have to abandon the slow, comfortable, and gradual timeline of geology that we were all taught in school. Mainstream science tells us that the Earth changes at a glacial pace, that continents drift apart at the speed of growing fingernails, and that climate change takes millions of years to turn a jungle into a desert. This is the doctrine of uniformitarianism, the belief that the present is the key to the past and that everything happens slowly. But the evidence trapped in the permafrost and the deep ice cores tells a much more violent, terrifying, and immediate story. It tells of a flash freeze, a cataclysmic event where the climate didn't just shift, it snapped. In the mid-20th century, a professor of history named Charles Hapgood proposed a theory that was so radical it terrified the academic establishment. It was called Earth crust displacement. Hapgood wasn't just a fringe theorist. His work was taken seriously enough that the foreword to his book, Earth's Shifting Crust, was written by none other than Albert Einstein, the greatest mind of the modern era. Einstein didn't just politely endorse it, he supported the physics behind it. The theory asks you to imagine the Earth not as a solid, immovable rock, but as a soft fruit with a hard skin, like an orange. The outer crust of the Earth, the lithosphere, is a thin, rigid shell floating on top of a molten, lubricating layer called the asthenosphere. Hapgood argued that this outer shell is not permanently attached to the core, it can slide. He proposed that over thousands of years the massive buildup of ice at the poles creates an imbalance. The ice caps become so heavy, so off-center, that the centrifugal force of the planet's rotation eventually causes the entire crust to detach and slip, essentially rotating the skin of the world around the core like the peel of an orange, sliding over the fruit. If such a displacement were to happen, the consequences would be biblical. It wouldn't take millions of years. It could happen in a matter of days, or perhaps even hours. Imagine a continent sitting comfortably in a temperate zone, basking in the sun, filled with forests, animals, and cities. Suddenly the ground beneath it lurches, massive earthquakes shatter the bedrock, tsunamis miles high sweep across the oceans as the water fails to keep up with the moving land, and the entire continent is physically shoved 2,000 miles south, straight into the polar circle. The drop in temperature would be instantaneous and absolute. It wouldn't be a slow cooling, it would be a thermal shock. We have physical proof that this has happened, and the evidence is gruesome. In the frozen tundra of Siberia and the Arctic Circle, which would have been the counterpart to Antarctica moving in the opposite direction, explorers have found the bodies of woolly mammoths that didn't just die, they were flash frozen. The most famous case is the Berezovka mammoth. When scientists examined the beast, they found it frozen in an upright position as if it had been casually walking, but the contents of its stomach revealed the horror of its final moments. They found fresh buttercups and flowering grasses, vegetation that only grows in a warm, temperate summer climate, still undigested in its stomach. Even more shocking, they found food, still in its mouth and between its teeth. The animal didn't have time to swallow. To freeze a massive, warm-blooded animal mid-chew, preserving the delicate cellular structure of the flowers in its stomach without them rotting, requires a temperature drop of roughly 150 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds. You cannot achieve this with a normal winter storm. You can only achieve this if the land itself is teleported from a spring meadow to a polar deep freeze in the blink of an eye. If we apply this terrifying model to the south, it explains everything about the Piri Reis map and the Orontes Phineas map. Around 12,000 years ago, a date that coincides with the end of the last ice age and the violent geological epoch known as the Younger Dryas, Antarctica was likely located significantly further north, protruding into the temperate zone. It was a habitable landmass, perhaps the center of a global maritime civilization. Then the crust shifted. The mechanism triggered. In a cataclysm of fire and ice, the continent was shoved to the bottom of the world. The ocean water that washed over it didn't just drown the land, it froze instantly, turning into the mile-thick ice sheet we see today. The mud that Plato described as blocking the Atlantic Ocean wasn't dirt. It was a slurry of churning ice and debris. This theory implies that the ice sheet of Antarctica is not a millions-year-old geological feature, but a relatively recent crime scene tarp. It is a burial shroud that was thrown over the continent to hide the bodies. The civilization that lived there didn't have time to pack their bags. They didn't have time to evacuate. They were hit by a wall of wind, water, and freezing darkness that wiped them out instantly, entombing their cities, their technology, and their libraries in a state of suspended animation. The reason we find coal deposits in Antarctica, which are just fossilized forests, and fossils of ferns and reptiles that require warmth to survive, is not because of continental drift over eons, but because the climate changed overnight. The Piri Reis map is a portrait of the victim before the murder. The modern map of Antarctica is the chalk outline. And if the elites are digging down there now, they aren't studying the ice, they are tunneling into the ruins of the world that existed before the slip. They are trying to recover what was lost in the flash freeze, knowing full well that the crust could slip again at any moment. If a technologically advanced civilization was indeed frozen instantly in the south, preserving its cities and secrets under a mile of ice, does it have a name? For thousands of years, the collective human psyche has been haunted by the memory of a lost paradise, a mother culture that mastered engineering, astronomy, and navigation long before history officially began. We call it Atlantis, but for centuries archaeologists and treasure hunters have been looking for it in all the wrong places. They have scoured the bottom of the Mediterranean, probed the islands of the Caribbean, and sifted through the sands of the Sahara, always finding nothing but disappointment. They failed because they were looking for a sunken island when they should have been looking for a displaced continent. If you strip away the Hollywood fantasies and go back to the original source text, the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias written by the Greek philosopher Plato around 360 BC, the description of Atlantis does not match a small Greek island like Santorini. It matches with terrifying precision the landmass of Antarctica. Let's look at the evidence, starting with the timeline. This is the smoking gun that most historians conveniently ignore. Plato was very specific about when Atlantis was destroyed. He wrote that the story was handed down to the Greek lawmaker Solon by the high priests of Egypt in the city of Sais. The priests told Solon that the cataclysm happened 9,000 years before this time. Solon visited Egypt around 600 BC. If you do the math, 9,000 plus 600, you get a date of roughly 9,600 BC. For decades, modern archaeologists laughed at this date, dismissing it as a random number invented by Plato to sound ancient. But today, thanks to modern geology and ice core samples from Greenland, we know something that Plato could not possibly have known. 9,600 BC is the exact, absolute date of the end of the Younger Dryas epoch. It is the precise moment when the last ice age ended violently, characterized by a massive global spike in sea levels known as meltwater pulse 1b. This was a time of unimaginable global chaos where the oceans rose hundreds of feet in a geological heartbeat. The fact that Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis aligns perfectly, to the century, with the actual geological date of the greatest climate catastrophe in human history is not a coincidence. It is a record. Now let's look at the size. Plato was explicit that Atlantis was not a small city-state. He described it as a massive empire, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. In the terminology of the ancient Greeks, Libya referred to North Africa, and Asia referred to the Middle East and Turkey. If you combine those landmasses, you are talking about a continental-sized territory, millions of square miles. There is no island in the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, or the Mediterranean that comes anywhere close to that size. The Azores are specks of dust. Santorini is a pebble. But there is one landmass that fits the description perfectly: Antarctica. It is a massive continent, roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, sitting isolated in the ocean. Plato described Atlantis as the way to the opposite continent, the Americas, stating that it sat in the middle of the real ocean. If you look at the globe from the perspective of the South Pole, Antarctica is the hub of the wheel, the center from which you can sail to Africa, South America, and Australia. It is the true naval center of the world. Then there is the topology. Plato described the capital city of Atlantis as being composed of concentric rings of water and land alternating like a target. He spoke of a central island surrounded by a ring of water, then a ring of land, and so on. Critics say this sounds like a myth, but look at the subglacial topography of Antarctica provided by NASA and the radar scans that confirm the Boachi map. We now know that Antarctica is not a single solid hump of rock. If you remove the ice, it is an archipelago. Specifically, the region of Lesser Antarctica is separated from Greater Antarctica by deep basins that lie below sea level. If the water levels were different, or if the ice formed in stages, the geography of Antarctica would naturally present itself as a series of massive islands and waterways that could easily be interpreted or engineered into concentric rings. The plain of Atlantis, described as a flat, rectangular plain surrounded by mountains, matches the dimensions of the Ross Ice Shelf and the Trans-Antarctic Mountains perfectly. But the most misunderstood clue is the mud. Plato wrote that after the cataclysm, the ocean where Atlantis stood became impassable and impenetrable because of the shallow mud which the island created as it settled. This detail has baffled explorers for centuries. How can a sinking island create enough mud to block an entire ocean? The answer lies in the translation. The Greek word Plato used doesn't just mean dirt, it refers to a thick, churning slurry. If we apply the Earth crust displacement theory, when the continent was shoved into the polar zone and the waters rushed over it, the result would not be calm water. It would be a chaotic, freezing slush of pulverized rock, sediment, and rapidly freezing ice. To a sailor trying to reach the continent in the aftermath of the disaster, the sea would indeed appear to be impassable mud, a sludge of forming pack ice that blocked all navigation. The ocean didn't get muddy, it got frozen. The sinking of Atlantis was a metaphor for its disappearance beneath the water and the ice. It didn't go down, it went south. Finally, consider the resources. Plato described the walls of the city as being plated with gold, silver, and a mysterious reddish metal called orichalcum, which was second only to gold in value. He claimed this metal was mined from the earth of the island itself. For centuries, orichalcum was thought to be mythical, But modern geology tells us that Antarctica is a treasure trove of minerals. It contains vast veins of coal, iron, copper, and potentially gold and uranium, preserved untouched by the ice. The red metal could easily be a high-purity copper alloy or a unique element that the ancients had mastered. The obsession of modern nations to secure mining rights in Antarctica under the guise of science supports this. They know the riches are there. If Antarctica is Atlantis, it changes everything. It means that the civilization we are looking for is not at the bottom of the sea, eroded by salt and currents. It is encased in a cryostatic chamber, preserved in pristine condition. The buildings, the machines, perhaps even the bodies of the inhabitants are still there, waiting under 2 miles of thermal insulation. The search for Atlantis is not a treasure hunt, it is a recovery mission. The elite factions visiting the continent, the secrecy of the treaty, the strange interest of the Vatican, it all points to one conclusion. They found the capital. They found the library. They know that the gods of ancient mythology, Poseidon, Zeus, Viracocha, were simply the kings and queens of this Antarctic empire who survived the shift and scattered to the rest of the world to restart civilization. We are the orphans of Antarctica, staring at the frozen corpse of our motherland, unaware that she is holding the secrets of our past and the keys to our future in her icy grip. If the stories of ancient maps, fleeing Nazis, and lost civilizations feel too abstract or rooted in folklore, let us turn our attention to the cold, hard data provided by the most advanced scientific agency on the planet, NASA. We often think of space agencies as looking up, but some of their most terrifying discoveries come when they look down. In 2006, a team of researchers from Ohio State University, working with NASA, released a set of data that should have been front-page news across the world. They had been analyzing the readings from the GRACE satellites, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. These satellites are unique. They do not take pictures of the ground. Instead, they fly in a precise formation, measuring minute variations in the Earth's gravitational pull. Gravity is not constant across the planet. It fluctuates based on the density of the material beneath the surface. A mountain range has more gravity than an ocean trench. A deposit of gold has more gravity than a deposit of sandstone. The GRACE satellites are essentially a planetary metal detector capable of seeing what is hidden deep beneath the oceans and the ice. When these satellites swept over a desolate region of East Antarctica known as Wilkes Land, the sensors went off the charts. They detected a mascon, short for mass concentration, that was so large and so dense it distorted the gravity field of the entire region. This wasn't just a blip, it was a behemoth. The anomaly measures roughly 300 miles or 480 kilometers in width. To put that catastrophic scale into perspective, the asteroid that slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula and wiped out the dinosaurs, the Chicxulub impactor, created a crater only about 110 miles wide. The thing buried in Wilkes Land is nearly 3 times the size of the apocalypse that killed the T-Rex. It is the largest impact structure ever discovered on Earth, buried under more than a mile of solid ice. Mainstream science rushed to provide a geological explanation. The prevailing theory, championed by Ralph von Fries and his team, is that this anomaly represents the scar of a colossal asteroid impact that occurred roughly 250 million years ago. This timing is significant because it aligns with the Permian-Triassic extinction event, also known as the Great Dying. This was the single worst event in the history of life on Earth, far worse than the death of the dinosaurs. In that event, 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species were wiped out. Life on Earth was nearly rebooted. If the Wilkes Land anomaly is indeed the crater from that event, it means Antarctica is the graveyard of the ancient world, the site of the bullet wound that nearly killed the planet. But there is a problem with the simple asteroid theory, and it lies in the nature of the gravity signal itself. Usually, when a massive space rock slams into a planet, the immense kinetic energy vaporizes the impactor and shatters the crust, creating a chaotic, low-density hole filled with rubble. The gravity signature should be a void or at least a messy mix of densities. However, the Wilkes Land anomaly features a distinct, localized, and extremely dense concentration of mass sitting right in the center of the ring. It looks less like a hollowed-out crater and more like a solid object that punched into the Earth and stayed there. The signal suggests a dense metallic lump that does not match the surrounding volcanic geology. This discrepancy has opened the door to the wildest and most disturbing theories in the Antarctic dossier. What if the mascon is not a natural formation? What if it is an artificial object? The density readings are consistent with heavy metals, iron, nickel, or perhaps alloys that we do not yet understand. Some fringe researchers and whistleblowers have proposed that the Wilkes Land anomaly is not a crater but a crash site. They argue that a massive metallic mothership, a craft the size of a small country, crash-landed there hundreds of millions of years ago, or perhaps was deliberately parked there. The force of its landing would have caused the extinction event, throwing up enough dust to block the sun for centuries, but the ship itself survived, buried by the aeons and the encroaching ice. If this is true, then the ice of Antarctica is effectively the hull of a buried starship. This theory aligns disturbingly well with the reports of magnetic anomalies in the region. Pilots flying near Wilkes Land have reported their compasses spinning wildly and their navigation systems malfunctioning, a classic sign of a powerful, artificial electromagnetic field interfering with local physics. It also aligns with the military interest. Why does the US military maintain such a heavy presence and surveillance grid over a frozen wasteland? If they were just drilling for ice cores to study ancient climates, a few scientists with a tent would suffice. But if there is a technological artifact 300 miles wide buried down there, a sleeping giant that emits a gravity field strong enough to be felt from space, then the entire Antarctic Treaty makes perfect sense. It is a cordon around the ultimate prize. They aren't studying the ice, they are trying to figure out how to dig up or power up the largest machine on the planet. Furthermore, the Wilkes Land anomaly sits geographically near the region where the hollow Earth entrances are rumored to be. In the esoteric model, a crash of this magnitude might not have just dented the surface, it might have punched a hole straight through the crust, creating an opening to the inner cavern systems. The object might be acting as a plug or a gatekeeper to the inner world. This connects to the strange seismic data. When earthquakes happen in Antarctica, which is rare, the shock waves often behave strangely when passing through this region, as if they are hitting a hollow space or a dampening field rather than solid rock. The implications of the Wilkes Land anomaly are terrifying regardless of whether it is natural or artificial. If it is a natural asteroid, it reminds us that the sky can fall at any moment and that Antarctica holds the evidence of our planet's fragility. But if it is artificial, it changes the entire story of the universe. It means we are walking on top of a derelict piece of technology that predates humanity by eons. It means the gods didn't just visit, they crashed. And it raises the question, is the object dead? Or is it simply in standby mode, waiting for a signal, or waiting for the ice to melt enough for its solar collectors to see the sun again? As the glaciers in East Antarctica begin to destabilize due to global warming, the shield covering this anomaly is thinning. We might be about to find out exactly what lies in the dark heart of Wilkes Land, and by the time we do, it might be too late to put the genie back in the bottle. The thing under the ice is the heavy, silent center of the Antarctic mystery, a gravitational anchor that holds all the other conspiracies together. It is the reason they went there. It is the reason they stay there. And it is the reason they won't let you go there. While satellites scan the deep underground for gravity anomalies, sometimes the most shocking evidence is sitting right on the surface, staring us in the face, hidden in plain sight. In recent years, the democratization of exploration through tools like Google Earth has allowed a new generation of armchair archaeologists to scour the frozen continent inch by inch from their living rooms. What they have found in the Ellsworth Mountains has sparked a firestorm of debate that refuses to die down. Standing starkly against the chaotic, jagged, and random peaks of the natural mountain range are structures that look undeniably, impossibly, like pyramids. We are not talking about vague, mound-like shapes that require a squint to see. We are talking about perfect, four-sided structures with sharp, defined ridges that align with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. The most famous of these structures, often referred to simply as the Antarctic Pyramid, measures exactly 400 feet tall at its base. This dimension is uncannily similar to the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. But it's not just the height, it's the geometry. In nature, mountains are formed by the chaotic forces of tectonic uplift and glacial erosion. They are messy. They have irregular slopes, multiple ridges, and asymmetrical faces. Wind and ice tear at rock in random patterns. Yet this structure possesses four distinct, triangular faces that meet at a sharp apex. The slope angle appears to be consistent on all sides, a feat of symmetry that nature abhors. When these images first went viral, mainstream geologists rushed to debunk them. They dismissed the structures as nunataks, a glaciological term for natural mountain peaks that just happened to poke through the ice sheet. They argued that millions of years of freeze-thaw cycles and wind erosion can carve rock into geometric shapes, a process known as faceting. They pointed to other pyramidal peaks like the Matterhorn in the Alps or Mount Búlandstindur in Iceland as proof that nature can build pyramids. And while it is true that nature can create rough geometric shapes, the mathematical probability of random erosion creating a perfect square-based pyramid with consistent slope angles on all four sides, oriented to the cardinal points in the middle of a range where no other peak looks like it, is astronomically low. It is like finding a perfect cube of polished granite in a pile of rubble and calling it a pebble. The existence of these pyramids of the South supports the theory of a global energy grid. If you look at the globe, you find pyramids on almost every continent. You find them in Egypt, in Mexico, in China, in Sudan, in Indonesia, Gunung Padang, and in Bosnia. Why would the ancients build the exact same difficult structure all over the world unless it served a specific technical function? The pyramid shape is the most stable structure for surviving cataclysms, but many researchers argue it is also a machine. Christopher Dunn and others have proposed that the Great Pyramid was a geomechanical power plant designed to harvest the vibrational energy of the Earth. If this is true, then finding a pyramid in Antarctica is the final piece of the puzzle. It would complete the global circuit. It suggests that in the pre-ice epoch, this continent was not just inhabited, but was a central hub, perhaps the central hub, of the same mother culture that built Giza and Teotihuacan. Consider the implications of the Piri Reis map again. If Antarctica was ice-free and inhabited 12,000 years ago, then these structures would have been standing in a temperate valley, likely surrounded by a city. The ice has simply swallowed the city, leaving only the tops of the tallest skyscrapers, the pyramids, poking through the snow. This mirrors what we would see if a new ice age buried modern Egypt. The only things sticking out of the glacier would be the tips of the Giza pyramids. Furthermore, there are rumors from military whistleblowers that these aren't the only pyramids. Some allege that there are much larger structures buried completely under the ice, detected only by ground-penetrating radar. These buried pyramids are said to emit powerful electromagnetic signatures that interfere with aircraft instruments. This brings to mind the strange events surrounding Buzz Aldrin's evacuation. If these structures are active machines, dormant but not dead, then the melting of Antarctica is a terrifying prospect for the elite. It means the off switch might be getting flipped back to on. The visual evidence is there, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. You can go to the coordinates yourself. You can see the shadow it casts. You can see the symmetry. It challenges us to believe that wind and snow could accidentally sculpt a masterpiece of engineering that matches the greatest wonders of the ancient world. It asks us to choose between an impossible coincidence of geology or a terrifying reality of history, that we are looking at the roof of a buried world, the capstone of a civilization that died so we could forget. The pyramids of Antarctica are the tombstones of Atlantis, marking the spot where the center of the world used to be. If the anomalies in Antarctica are just frozen rocks and the bases are just innocent research stations studying the weather, then we are left with a burning question that defies all political logic. Why are the most powerful, influential, and elderly people on Earth suddenly so desperate to visit them? In the year 2016, a bizarre and unprecedented pattern of travel emerged. It wasn't tourists or scientists heading south. It was the masters of the geopolitical and religious world. This wasn't a photo op, it was a pilgrimage, and the timing suggests that something down there had woken up and demanded an audience. The strange sequence of events began with a figure who has no business in a scientific outpost, Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. In February of 2016, Kirill made history. First, he met with Pope Francis in Havana, Cuba. This was the first time the heads of the Eastern and Western churches had met since the Great Schism of the year 1054, nearly 1,000 years of silence broken in a single afternoon. They signed a joint declaration, but conspiracy theorists argue the meeting was about something far more urgent than theology. Immediately after this historic summit, Patriarch Kirill didn't go home to Moscow. He flew to Antarctica. The official story was that he went to pray at a tiny wooden Orthodox church on King George Island and to walk among the penguins. But let's be realistic. This is a 70-year-old religious leader. You do not fly thousands of miles to the most inhospitable place on Earth, risking your health and safety just to bless the ice. Rumors exploded within the esoteric community that Kirill was acting as a courier or a witness. The most persistent theory involves the Ark of Gabriel, a mysterious religious artifact allegedly unearthed during construction work at the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 2015. The story goes that the artifact was so powerful and dangerous, emitting plasma bursts that allegedly killed construction workers, that the Saudi authorities, terrified, handed it over to the Russians for safekeeping. The theory claims that Kirill's mission was to transport this ancient weapon, or library, to the only place on Earth where it could be safely contained, the Antarctic interior, potentially to the Ark of the Gabriel site or a similar ancient repository. Whether you believe the supernatural elements or not, the optics are undeniable. The head of Russian Christendom felt an urgent, spiritual need to stand on the Antarctic ice at a crucial turning point in history. He wasn't there to preach to the scientists, he was there to perform a ritual. But the weirdness didn't stop with religion. It moved to politics. In November of 2016, as the United States was gripped by the most contentious and chaotic presidential election in modern history, Trump versus Clinton, John Kerry, the sitting U.S. Secretary of State, did the unthinkable. He left the country. On Election Day, when the entire world was watching Washington, America's top diplomat was thousands of miles away, standing in the freezing wind of McMurdo's station. Why? The official explanation was that he wanted to see the effects of climate change firsthand. This excuse is laughably thin. John Kerry has access to every satellite image, every climate report, and every scientist on the payroll. He didn't need to fly to the South Pole to know that ice melts. His trip was hurried, logistically complex, and bizarrely timed. Why leave the helm of the ship during a political hurricane? The only logical conclusion is that the meeting in Antarctica was more important than the election in America. Speculation suggests that Kerry was there to negotiate or perhaps to inspect something that had been found. If the ice shelves were melting and revealing ancient fortifications or crashed technology, the Secretary of State would be the exact person sent to assess the geopolitical fallout. Was he there to sign a new treaty? Was he there to receive orders from the breakaway civilization that controls the region? His presence suggests that the real seat of power is not in the White House, but in a bunker beneath the Ross ice shelf. And then, just weeks later, the final piece of the Trinity arrived: Buzz Aldrin. The legendary astronaut, the second man to walk on the moon, a man who has seen more of the universe than almost anyone. At 86 years old, Aldrin undertook the grueling journey to the South Pole. He was part of a private tour group, but a man of his stature is never just a tourist. His visit was cut short by a medical emergency. He suffered from fluid in his lungs and had to be frantically evacuated to Christchurch, New Zealand. But it is what happened during his evacuation that set the internet on fire. A tweet allegedly appeared on his official verified Twitter account, showing a picture of a pyramid-shaped mountain in Antarctica with the chilling caption, "We are all in danger. It is evil itself." The tweet was deleted almost instantly, and his representatives claimed he was hacked or that it never happened. But the screenshot lives on. Even if the tweet was a hoax, the context of his visit remains disturbing. Why did an astronaut, a man obsessed with colonizing Mars, feel the need to see the South Pole before he died? Was he looking for a similarity? Did he know that the same structures found on the Moon or Mars are also present under the Antarctic ice? His medical collapse suggests he might have been exposed to something, perhaps the same frequencies or biological agents that the elites are rumored to be studying. In the span of a single year, 2016, we saw the leaders of religion, Kirill, politics, Kerry, and space, Aldrin, all converge on the forbidden continent. This was a summit. It signals that the containment of Antarctica is failing or entering a new phase. They weren't there to look at the past. They were there to prepare for the future. The rush of visits implies a deadline. Whatever is down there, be it the Watchers, the ancient libraries, or the sleeping technology of Atlantis, is waking up. And the elites are terrified. They know that once the ice melts and the truth is revealed, their control over the narrative of human history will shatter instantly. They didn't go south to save the planet. They went south to save themselves. But the secrets of Antarctica are not just waiting on the surface, exposed to the wind and the satellites. They are waiting in the crushing, absolute darkness of the abyss. To understand the true biological horror of the continent, we have to look down, straight down through 2.5 miles of solid, ancient ice, to a place that should not exist. This is Lake Vostok. It is not merely a pocket of slush, it is a massive liquid freshwater ocean, roughly the size of Lake Ontario or the entire country of Lebanon, sealed off from the rest of the planet by a frozen lid that is 4,000 meters thick. This water has not seen the light of the sun or tasted the atmosphere of Earth for at least 15 million years. It is the ultimate alien world, a time capsule of the Eocene era locked away in a cryostatic prison. And in 2012, after decades of drilling, a team of Russian scientists finally managed to breach the seal. But what they found, and more importantly what they didn't tell us, is the subject of the most terrifying leak in modern scientific history. The environment of Lake Vostok is like nothing else on Earth. It is a place of extremes that defies biological logic. The water is kept liquid only by the immense pressure of the ice sheet above, which lowers the freezing point, and by the geothermal heat radiating from the Earth's core below. It is a pitch-black, pressurized cauldron. But the most critical factor is the oxygen. Because the ice sheet slowly melts into the lake over millions of years, releasing trapped air bubbles, the water in Lake Vostok is supersaturated with oxygen, roughly 50 times higher than a normal freshwater lake. In biology, high oxygen levels combined with isolation often lead to a phenomenon known as abyssal gigantism. We see this in the deep ocean, where squids grow to the size of school buses and crabs span 10 feet. In an environment with 50 times the oxygen, metabolic rates change. Evolution takes a different, monstrous path. Life doesn't just survive there, it grows. It becomes stronger, faster, and smarter. For years, the Russian team at Vostok Station drilled slowly, stopping just feet above the waterline, terrified of contaminating the pristine ecosystem with drilling fluid, or perhaps terrified of what might come up the drill shaft. When they finally pierced the water in February 2012, the global media reported that they found unknown DNA and strange bacteria that didn't match any known genetic profile. But in the dark corners of the Russian intelligence community, a different story emerged. A defector, claiming to be part of the team, leaked a report about Organism 46B. According to the account, Organism 46B is not a bacteria. It is a highly intelligent predatory cephalopod, an octopus-like creature, with 14 arms and extreme camouflage abilities. But unlike a normal octopus that changes color, this creature can allegedly manipulate its shape and heat signature to become invisible to infrared and sonar. The report describes a nightmare scenario where the creature was not just an animal, but a strategic killer. It claims that on the first day of the encounter, the creature jammed the team's radio equipment, seemingly understanding that the humans were communicating. It then used its potent, paralyzing toxin, released as a cloud in the water, to incapacitate a diver from a distance of 150 feet. The toxin didn't kill him instantly. It left him in a catatonic state, fully conscious but unable to move as the creature approached. The most chilling detail of the leak is the creature's method of hunting. It is said to possess mimicry capabilities that go beyond simple camouflage. The whistleblower claimed that Organism 46B could shapeshift to look like a human diver, a trick it likely developed to hunt seals or penguins that might have existed in the lake millions of years ago, or perhaps to hunt us. The leaked report states that 3 members of the Russian team were killed by the organism before it was finally captured and contained. The survivors were sworn to absolute secrecy, and the body of the creature was allegedly transported to a secure facility in Russia for military study. While skeptics dismiss Organism 46B as a creepypasta, the biological reality of Lake Vostok supports the possibility of such a predator. We know that the lake has a heat source. We know it has oxygen. We know it has been isolated long enough for a completely divergent evolutionary line to emerge. If nature can create the mimic octopus in the shallow waters of Indonesia, What can it create in 15 million years of total isolation in a high-pressure, hyper-oxygenated tank? We might have drilled into a prehistoric colosseum where only the deadliest organisms survived. But the mystery of Vostok isn't just biological, it's technological. The same magnetic surveys that mapped the lake's shoreline also detected a massive, perfectly circular magnetic anomaly on the southeast shore of the lake. It is a distinct, powerful magnetic distortion that does not match the surrounding volcanic rock. It looks artificial. This has led to the hollow Earth theory that Lake Vostok is not just a lake, but a transit hub. The anomaly could be a massive metallic structure, a base, a city, or a docking port that uses the geothermal energy of the lake and the privacy of the ice as the ultimate camouflage. If the Nazis or an ancient civilization wanted a hiding spot, Vostok is perfect. It is invisible from space, impervious to nuclear bombardment, protected by 2 miles of ice, and has a limitless supply of fresh water and geothermal power. The Russian drilling project has gone strangely quiet in recent years. After the initial fanfare of the breach, the updates became vague. They speak of analyzing samples, but release no images of the larger life forms. Did they find the creature? Did they find the anomaly? Or did they find that the lake is already occupied? We are poking a needle into a dark room, and we felt something grab the tip. The silence from Vostok Station is not the silence of failure, it is the silence of containment. We have breached the quarantine of a lost world, and we might not be prepared for what is swimming up the hole to meet us. On the surface, the scientific presence in Antarctica is presented to the public as a benign, cooperative effort to study the cosmos and the climate. We are shown pictures of bearded scientists in parkas releasing weather balloons or counting penguins. But if you peel back the layers of public relations, you find machinery that looks less like science and more like war. The prime suspect in this technological masquerade is the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory, located at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. Officially, this is the world's largest neutrino telescope designed to detect tiny, ghost-like particles that travel through the universe. But the sheer scale, the funding sources, and the specific capabilities of this device suggest a purpose far more sinister and proactive than simple observation. To understand the suspicion, you have to look at the construction. IceCube is not a telescope in the traditional sense. It doesn't have lenses or mirrors. It is a massive subterranean grid. The construction involved using high-pressure hot water drills to melt 86 holes, each over 1.5 miles deep, into the pristine Antarctic ice sheet. Into these holes, they lowered strings of cable, each holding 60 digital optical modules, DOMs, basketball-sized sensors extremely sensitive to light. This effectively turns a cubic kilometer of solid ice into the world's largest sensor array. The official story is that when a neutrino passes through the Earth and collides with an atom in the ice, it creates a faint flash of blue light called Cherenkov radiation, which the sensors detect. This allows scientists to map high-energy events in deep space. But here is the first red flag. The logistics and the technology come straight from the military-industrial complex. The primary logistical support for the station is not provided by universities, but by defense contractors like Raytheon. Raytheon is the world's largest producer of guided missiles and missile defense systems. They build the Patriot missile, they build the Tomahawk, they build the electronic warfare suites for fighter jets. Why is a company that specializes in blowing things up and jamming enemy radar running the logistics for a peaceful neutrino telescope? When a defense contractor builds a device that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, they usually expect a weapon, or at the very least a strategic advantage, in return. Conspiracy theorists and whistleblowers have long argued that IceCube is not just a passive listener. It is an active transmitter. The technology used in the digital optical modules is strikingly similar to the phased array technology used in directed energy weapons, DEW, and SHARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. A phased array antenna can steer a beam of energy electronically without moving the antenna itself. It can focus energy into a tight, destructive beam or a wide scanning signal. The theory proposes that IceCube is actually a massive directed energy weapon buried in the ice. Because neutrinos and extremely low-frequency ELF waves can pass through the Earth, a transmitter at the South Pole could potentially fire a beam through the planet to hit a target on the other side. It could be used to disrupt communications, destroy satellites, or even manipulate the weather and tectonic plates. This brings us to the terrifying correlation with seismic activity. Some independent researchers have pointed out a disturbing pattern. Massive spikes in neutrino detection at the South Pole often precede or coincide with significant, unexplained earthquakes elsewhere on the globe. The most cited example is the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand in 2011. New Zealand is geographically aligned with Antarctica in a way that makes it a prime target for energy testing. Was the earthquake a natural disaster, or was it the result of a test fire of the IceCube array, a scalar weapon pulse that destabilized the fault line? If the array can focus energy through the Earth's core, acting as a planetary lens, it would be the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, one that leaves no trace, no missile trail, and allows the attacker to blame Mother Nature for the devastation. But there is a more local and perhaps even more frightening theory that IceCube is a traffic control system. If the theories about the hollow Earth, base 211, or the Wilkes Land anomaly are true, then the interior of our planet is not solid rock. It is a busy airspace. If there are indeed unidentified crafts, be they Nazi saucers or extraterrestrial vehicles, entering and exiting the Earth through polar openings or operating from deep underwater bases like Lake Vostok, a standard radar system would be useless. Radar cannot see through rock or miles of ice, but neutrinos can. Neutrinos travel through solid matter as easily as light travels through glass. If you wanted to build a surveillance grid to track movements inside the Earth, to watch the traffic moving through the mantle or the subglacial tunnels, a neutrino detector is exactly what you would build. In this scenario, IceCube is the air traffic control tower for the breakaway civilization. It monitors the comings and goings of the fleet. This explains why it is located exactly at the South Pole, the central hub of the hypothesized polar entrance. It explains why the data is filtered before it reaches the public. The scientists might see anomalies or track lines that they are told to ignore or classify as errors, but the military analysts at Raytheon know exactly what they are looking at. They are tracking the bogies coming up from the basement. Furthermore, IceCube does not work alone. It is likely part of a global grid of observatories and ionospheric heaters, including HAARP in Alaska and CERN in Switzerland. Together, they form a planetary cage, a surveillance and control mechanism that locks down the Earth both physically and dimensionally. The energy consumption of these facilities is enormous. The computational power required to process the data is staggering. We are asked to believe this is all to answer abstract questions about the Big Bang, but governments do not spend billions on abstract questions, they spend billions on control. IceCube is the sentinel. It is the all-seeing eye at the bottom of the world, staring not at the stars, but into the deep, dark heart of the planet, watching for the moment when the things living down there decide to come up. This journey into the shadows brings us back full circle to the man who arguably started it all, Admiral Richard E. Byrd. While his official military reports on Operation Highjump were alarming enough to terrify the US government into silence, it is his alleged secret diary that contains the most earth-shattering claim of all. This document, disputed by historians but revered by truth-seekers, purports to be the transcript of a flight Byrd took over the South Pole on February 19, 1947. If the contents of this diary are even partially true, then everything we think we know about the shape and structure of our planet is a lie. We are not living on a solid rock. We are living on a shell. According to the diary, Byrd was piloting a standard reconnaissance flight over the frozen plateau when he began to experience severe instrument failure. His magnetic compasses spun wildly and his gyroscopes oscillated, refusing to lock onto a heading. This is a common phenomenon reported by polar pilots, usually attributed to the proximity of the magnetic pole. But what happened next defies all meteorological explanation. Byrd reported that the shimmering white ice beneath him began to fade, replaced by a brown and green coloration. He dropped altitude to investigate and realized he was not looking at ice, but at land. He saw a mountain range that was not on any map. He followed the valley and saw a river flowing through the center. But the temperature gauge in his cockpit, which should have been reading 40 degrees below zero, began to climb rapidly. It hit 0, then 30, then settled at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He was flying over a temperate oasis in the middle of the Antarctic. The description gets even more surreal. Byrd claims he saw vegetation, lush forests covering the mountain slopes. He saw animals. Looking down through his binoculars, he identified a massive beast moving through the underbrush. It wasn't a polar bear, it was an elephant-like creature with long hair. He realized with shock that he was looking at a woolly mammoth, a creature supposed to be extinct for 10,000 years, grazing in a hidden valley heated by geothermal vents or an internal sun. This aligns perfectly with the flash freeze theory. Perhaps not all the animals died. Perhaps some found their way into the warm, protected interior. As Byrd continued flying into this land beyond the pole, his radio crackled with a message. But it wasn't in English. It was in a heavily accented Germanic tongue, yet warm and welcoming. The voice said, "Welcome to our territory, Admiral." Suddenly, his plane was flanked by aircraft that possessed no wings. They were disc-shaped, glowing with a soft light, and marked with a symbol that looked like a swastika, or perhaps the ancient sun wheel from which the swastika was derived. Byrd's controls were neutralized. A tractor beam took over his plane and guided him down to a landing in a shimmering, rainbow-colored city made of a crystal-like substance. This was Agartha, or the Rainbow City, the capital of the inner world. The diary describes Byrd being escorted by tall, blonde-haired humans, the Nordic phenotype often associated with Pleiadian aliens or the Nazi Aryan ideal, to meet a figure referred to only as the Master. This leader didn't threaten Byrd. Instead, he delivered a somber warning. The Master explained that the inner civilization had largely ignored the surface dwellers until the United States detonated the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That act of nuclear violence sent shockwaves through the Earth that were felt in the inner world. The Master warned that humanity had discovered a power it was not morally ready to control, and that if we continued on our path of nuclear proliferation, we would destroy the surface of the planet, rendering it uninhabitable just as previous civilizations had done. Byrd was told he was chosen as a messenger because of his high character, and was tasked with bringing this warning back to the U.S. government. Upon his return to the outer world, Byrd was immediately detained. He was interrogated by the top-secret security forces for 6 hours. He was ordered to remain silent for the good of humanity, an order that he, as a disciplined soldier, obeyed for most of his life, only hinting at the truth in his cryptic final interviews. Skeptics dismissed the diary as a fraud, noting that Byrd was officially recorded as being on the other side of Antarctica on that date. But in the world of Black Ops, official logs are the first things to be faked. The secret diary serves as the foundational text for the hollow Earth theory, which posits that the Earth is a torus, a donut shape, with massive openings at both poles protected by a magnetic field and cloud cover that hides them from view. This theory offers a disturbing explanation for the blind spot in modern aviation and satellite coverage. If you look at the flight paths of commercial airliners and even the orbital paths of most satellites, they do not fly directly over the geometric South Pole. There is a gap in the coverage, a zone of silence. NASA explains this as a limitation of orbital mechanics. Geostationary satellites orbit the equator, and polar orbiting satellites move in strips. But conspiracy theorists argue this is a deliberate no-fly zone enforced to hide the physical hole in the crust. If a commercial plane flew directly over the pole, the passengers would look down and see the ocean pouring into the interior or the green glow of the inner sun. The Antarctic Treaty, the military blockades, the secrecy, it's all a mechanism to guard the entrance. We are living on the roof of a much larger, much older house, completely unaware that the landlords are living comfortably in the living room downstairs. The implications of Byrd's diary are transformative. It suggests that the UFOs we see are not extraterrestrial. They are ultra-terrestrial. They are our neighbors. They are the advanced descendants of Atlantis, or perhaps a separate branch of humanity that went underground to survive the cataclysms. They have been watching us bomb ourselves and poison our oceans with the pity of an older sibling watching a toddler play with a loaded gun. The silence of the South is not empty. It is a waiting room. And if Byrd was right, the door is about to open. If we have the courage to follow the trail of crumbs left by Admiral Byrd, the ancient map makers, and the anomalies of modern aviation to their logical extreme, we inevitably collide with the most controversial, ridiculed, yet terrifying concept in modern geography: the ice wall. For decades, the very mention of a wall around the world has been dismissed as the hallmark of medieval superstition or the raving of internet madmen. We are conditioned from kindergarten to visualize the planet as a perfect sphere floating in a vacuum, with Antarctica as a jagged, island-like continent plastered onto the bottom. But we must pause and ask a dangerous question. What if that shape is a lie? What if the map we use is not a representation of a planet, but a schematic of a prison? To understand the ice wall, we first have to look at the behavior of the early explorers who tried to circumnavigate Antarctica, specifically the legendary Captain James Cook. In the late 18th century, Captain Cook, arguably the greatest navigator in British history, embarked on a mission to find the fabled southern continent. He spent 3 grueling years sailing south, trying to find the end of the ice. According to the globe model, the circumference of Antarctica is roughly 11,000 miles. If you sail around it, that is the distance you should travel. Yet, Cook sailed over 60,000 miles along the southern rim, a distance that is nearly 3 times the circumference of the Earth at the equator. He never found an inlet. He never found the back of the continent. He simply sailed along a seemingly endless, formidable barrier of ice that offered no path through. He described it as a wall of ice rising hundreds of feet into the air, stretching as far as the eye could see, day after day, month after month. He eventually ran out of supplies and had to turn back, defeated by the sheer impossibility of the geometry. How can a ship sail 60,000 miles around a continent that is only supposed to be 11,000 miles wide? The math simply does not add up on a ball. It only adds up if Antarctica is not an island, but a ring, a containment perimeter that surrounds the oceans and continents we know. This brings us to the azimuthal equidistant projection, a map that dates back centuries but is curiously used today by the United States Geological Survey, the military for air and naval operations, and, most famously, as the official logo of the United Nations. On this map, the North Pole is at the center, and the continents are spread out from there. But there is no South Pole. Instead, Antarctica is depicted as a ring of ice that encircles the entire world, holding the oceans in place like the rim of a pizza. In this model, the South Pole is not a point, it is a perimeter, and the ice wall is the physical barrier that separates our known world from whatever lies beyond. Why would the UN, an organization dedicated to global governance, choose a flat Earth map as its symbol? Is it a design choice, or is it a subtle nod to the true shape of the territory they control? But the theory goes much deeper and darker than simple geography. It moves into the realm of the terra infinita model. There are ancient maps, such as the Japanese map of 1912, or the intricate maps reportedly found in the archives of Hawaiian moon temples that depict our known world, the 7 continents and the known oceans, as merely one small sector, or pond, in a much, much larger planetary plane. In this terrifyingly vast model, the ice wall is not the edge of the world, it is merely the fence line of our specific enclosure. Admiral Byrd himself, in a televised interview in 1955, referred to Antarctica as that enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery. But then he said something that chills the blood. He spoke of a land mass the size of the United States that had never been seen by a human being, located beyond the pole. We have to parse that sentence carefully. On a globe, there is no beyond the South Pole. Once you hit the 90-degree mark, you are heading north again. You are heading towards Australia or South America. There is no beyond, unless, of course, the pole is not the end, unless the ice is not a cap, but a bridge to the next sector. Imagine a massive, infinite plane of existence, dotted with pockets of habitable land, melted out of the ice by local suns or energy sources. We live in one of these pockets. The aliens, or extraterrestrials we have been searching for in the stars with our radio telescopes, might not be crossing light years of empty space to get here. They might simply be coming from the sector next door. They might be crossing the ice. This recontextualizes human history as a local affair in a vast, occupied neighborhood. The Nordic aliens described by abductees look human because they are human. Cousins who live in the lush lands beyond the ice ring, the ancestral lands or the summer gate. They possess superior technology not because they are from another galaxy, but because they have had thousands of years of uninterrupted development, while we in the Earth sector have been subjected to constant cataclysms and resets. If this is true, then the Antarctic Treaty is not about protecting penguins, it is about border control. The massive no-fly zones, the heavy surveillance, the refusal to allow independent exploration. It creates a sterile buffer zone. It prevents us from wandering off the reservation, and it prevents them from casually wandering in. We are told we are explorers, the masters of our domain. But if the ice wall theory holds even a grain of truth, we are actually livestock. We are living in a biological preserve, a terrarium managed by a warden class that guards the gates. Think about the psychological impact of the globe model versus the infinite plane model. A globe is a closed loop. It is finite. It implies that there is nowhere left to go, nothing left to discover. It breeds a sense of scarcity, of limits, of a Malthusian trap. If we destroy this rock, we have nowhere to run, but an infinite plane, a world where there are more lands beyond. That implies infinite resources, infinite space, and infinite possibility. Why would the elites want to hide that? Because a population that knows there is unlimited land next door is a population that cannot be controlled. They would pack their bags and leave. They would reject the scarcity-based economy, the taxes, and the control grid. To keep the inmates in the prison, you must convince them that the prison is the entire universe. You must convince them that outside the walls there is only the vacuum of space, deadly and empty. You must build a mental wall to reinforce the physical one. The sector theory aligns disturbingly well with the silence. If you were hiding a single bunker, you would camouflage it. But if you are hiding the fact that the Earth is 10 times larger than we are told, you have to hide the horizon itself. You have to invent a cosmology that curves the extra land away from view. You have to create a planet Earth to hide the realm Earth. The ice wall stands as the silent, frozen sentinel at the edge of our reality, mocking our arrogance. We send rovers to Mars looking for dust and dead rocks while ignoring the possibility that a lush, advanced living world exists just a few thousand miles south of Argentina, hidden behind a curtain of snow. The ultimate conspiracy is not that they are hiding the truth from us, it is that they are hiding us from the truth of where we actually live. We are not alone in the universe, and we are certainly not alone on this Earth. The wall is there. The question is, who built it, and when will it fall? But walls, no matter how high, how cold, or how heavily guarded, cannot last forever. We are currently witnessing the greatest threat to the secrecy regime that has ruled Antarctica for 60 years. It is not a foreign army, it is not a whistleblower, it is nature itself. The ice is melting. Climate change, regardless of its cause, whether it is human industrial activity, a natural solar cycle, or the deliberate manipulation of the ionosphere by weapons like HAARP, is doing what no spy could ever achieve. It is peeling back the camouflage. As the massive ice shelves in West Antarctica collapse and the glaciers retreat at unprecedented speeds, they are exposing things that have been hidden for 12,000 years. The white noise that has blinded our satellites is fading, and the signal from the past is becoming clearer every day. In 2016, the same year the elites rushed to the continent, strange images began to circulate in the dark corners of the internet. Satellite feeds, usually scrubbed by algorithms before reaching the public maps, showed what looked undeniably like man-made fortifications emerging from the snow. We are talking about hexagonal structures, straight lines that run for miles, and unnatural formations that look like the foundations of massive buildings. In the Shackleton Range, ridges have emerged that look suspiciously like the walls of an ancient fortress, stripped bare by the retreating frost. The panic among the intelligence agencies is palpable. They know that you cannot hide a continent-sized city forever. Eventually a piece of the ice will fall away, and a pyramid, a tower, or a crashed vessel will be exposed to the open air, visible to any commercial satellite or private drone that dares to fly close enough. But the melt is releasing more than just ruins. It is releasing biology. Scientists drilling into the permafrost and the melting glaciers are finding zombie viruses, pathogens that have been dormant for tens of thousands of years. In 2014, researchers revived a giant virus called Pithevirus sibericum from the Siberian permafrost. It was 30,000 years old, and the moment it thawed, it became infectious again. Now imagine what is trapped in the much older, much deeper ice of Antarctica. If the continent was once inhabited by a sophisticated civilization or hosted biological laboratories of the gods, the ice could be trapping biological agents that our modern immune systems have no defense against. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the recent waves of global pandemics are not accidents of nature, but leaks from the Antarctic thaw. ancient biological weapons that are waking up as the refrigerator door is left open. The quarantine is failing on a microscopic level. This looming exposure explains the sudden, desperate, and almost maniacal obsession of the global elite with Plan B, Mars. Why in the last decade have billionaires like Elon Musk and governments like the US and China suddenly decided that we must colonize Mars now? We are told it is for the survival of the species in case of an asteroid or nuclear war. But looking at the timeline of the Antarctic melt, a darker motive emerges. They are not trying to expand humanity. They are building a lifeboat. They know that the landlord of Earth is waking up. They know that the cycles of catastrophe described in books like The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas, a book that was classified by the CIA for decades, are real. The theory states that the Earth undergoes a cyclical pole shift, a cataclysm that wipes out civilization and resets the clock. The melting of the poles is the precursor to this shift. The elites are not going to Mars to explore, they are going there to hide. They are terrified that when the ice melts completely, the technology or the entities found down there will retake control of the planet, and the current ruling class will be held accountable. The disclosure we have been waiting for, the admission that we are not alone, might not come from a somber president standing behind a podium in the White House. It might come from the ground up. It might come when a massive chunk of the Ross ice shelf breaks off, revealing the pristine golden capstone of a megastructure that has been waiting in the dark since the end of the last ice age. The ice is the only thing standing between our fabricated history and the undeniable reality of our past. It is the curtain in the theatre, and it is catching fire. We are also seeing a shift in the magnetic field that suggests the mechanism of the Earth is changing. The south magnetic pole is moving. It has left the continent of Antarctica and is drifting towards the ocean. This migration is confusing navigation systems and animals alike. In the esoteric view, this is the unlocking of the mechanism. The energy grid that held the prison together is fluctuating. This is why we see an increase in UFO sightings, strange hums heard around the world, and the erratic behavior of the sun. The system is rebooting. The awakening is not just a spiritual concept, it is a geophysical event. The vibration of the planet is raising, the ice is thinning, and the secrets are bubbling to the surface. This places us, the current generation, in a unique and terrifying position. We are the witnesses to the end of the epoch. We are the ones who will see the map redrawn. The narrative that civilization began 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia is about to be obliterated by the revelation that a global, high-tech society thrived while Europe was under ice. The psychological shock of this revelation will be total. It will destroy religions, topple governments, and rewrite every science textbook. The elites are trying to manage the panic, to drip-feed us the truth through soft disclosure, leaking videos of Navy encounters with UFOs, admitting to the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena. They are trying to desensitize us so that when the ice finally reveals the mothership or the city, we won't collapse in terror. But the clock is ticking faster than they can manage. The melt is accelerating. The Thwaites Glacier, known as the Doomsday Glacier, is hanging by a thread. If it collapses, it won't just raise sea levels, it will open the front door to the interior of West Antarctica. It will expose the entrance. The race is on between the natural revelation of the truth and the elite's attempt to escape or control it. We are standing on the precipice of a new world, a world where the ice no longer protects us from the truth of who we are and where we came from. The winter is ending, the spring is coming, and in Antarctica, spring reveals the bones of the giants. We have traveled to the bottom of the world tonight, peeling back the layers of history, geology, and conspiracy to stare into the white abyss of the Antarctic. In doing so, we have done more than just explore a continent. We have peered into the deepest, darkest mirror of the human story. What we see reflected back at us is not just ice and snow, but the terrifying fragility of the reality we think we know. We are taught that we live in an age of information, where every square inch of the planet is mapped, every question has a scientific answer, and no stone is left unturned. But Antarctica stands as a silent, frozen monument to our ignorance. It is the blank space on the map that screams the loudest. It proves that the known world is just a small, illuminated island in a vast ocean of secrets that have been deliberately kept in the dark. Think back to the threads we have pulled. None of them stand alone. They weave together into a tapestry that depicts a history of the world completely different from the one in our textbooks. The Antarctic Treaty wasn't a handshake of peace, it was the construction of a prison wall. Operation Highjump wasn't a training mission, it was a failed prison break. The Nazis didn't go south to ski, they went to reclaim a heritage they believed was theirs. The Piri Reis map isn't a mistake, it is a memory. The pyramids in the Ellsworth Mountains are not tricks of the wind, they are the tombstones of a golden age. And the anomalies deep beneath the ice, the gravity wells in Wilkesland, the monsters in Lake Vostok, are the sleeping giants that are beginning to stir. Why go to such lengths to hide it? Why the treaties, the blockades, the disinformation, the ridicule of anyone who asks questions? The answer is power. If the world knew what was really down there, the current hierarchy of power would collapse overnight. If we knew that free energy technology existed and was being hoarded in underground bases, the oil and gas industries that enslave our economy would crumble. If we knew that human history goes back tens of thousands of years to advanced civilizations that spanned the globe, the religious and political narratives that keep us divided would dissolve. If we knew that we were not alone, that we were sharing this planet or this sector with other intelligences, the fear-mongering that justifies our military budgets would look pathetic. The secret of Antarctica is not just about aliens or ruins, it is about us. It is about keeping us small. It is about keeping us in the dark, convinced that we are the accidental children of apes, struggling on a dying rock when in reality we might be the heirs to a planetary empire currently under a temporary quarantine. But as we discuss, the quarantine is breaking, the ice is melting, the physical barrier that has kept the secret safe for 12,000 years is turning into water. We are living through the most significant transition in recorded history. You are not just watching a video, you are witnessing the end of an epoch. The generation alive today will be the generation that sees the map redrawn. We will be the ones to see the headlines that change everything, whether it comes from a whistleblower, a catastrophic glacial collapse, or a slow drip feed of soft disclosure from the government trying to get ahead of the story. The truth is coming. It cannot be stopped. The vibrations are rising, the magnetic poles are shifting, and the ancient mechanisms are unlocking. This leaves you with a choice. You can choose to retreat into the comfort of the official narrative, to believe that the ice is just ice, that the politicians went south for the climate, and that the history books are complete. It is a safe choice. It is a comfortable sleep. Or you can choose to stay awake. You can choose to look at the anomalies, to read the maps, to listen to the whispers of the pilots and the explorers who saw too much. You can choose to embrace the terrifying but liberating possibility that the world is bigger, stranger, and more magical than you were ever told. The silence of the South is breaking, the wind is howling, and it is calling your name. The question is no longer, what are they hiding? We know what they are hiding. The question now is, what will we do when the wall comes down? Will we be paralyzed by fear, or will we have the courage to step through the gate and claim our lost inheritance? The history of humanity is not a straight line, it is a cycle. And we are coming full circle. The winter is ending. The summer of truth is approaching. If this journey into the forbidden zone chilled you to the bone or sparked a fire in your mind, if it made you question the shape of your world even for a second, then I ask you to ignite that like button. It is a small signal, but it tells the algorithm and the world that we are watching, that we are listening, and that we are hungry for the truth. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because as the ice melts, the updates will come faster, and you do not want to be left in the cold. I want to hear from you in the comments below. This is the most important part of our investigation, the hive mind. Tell me, do you believe the ice wall is a physical barrier to other lands? Do you think the Nazis found an entrance to the inner Earth? Or do you think it is all a distraction from something even worse? I read every single theory you share, no matter how wild. We are piecing this puzzle together, one comment at a time. For those who want to support our research further and help us keep digging where they don't want us to dig, check the links in the description. There are resources there, deeper dives, and ways to join our community of truth seekers. But most importantly, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop looking at the horizon. The map is not finished. The story is not over. Until next time, remember, history doesn't hide, it waits, and it is tired of waiting. Good night.